This is the Kursk, the pride of the Russian Navy. A submarine so powerful, it's capable of taking on an entire carrier group by itself. At this moment, however, it, alongside its crew of 118 men, find themselves preparing to take part in an exercise. You see, the Kursk was an integral part of Exercise Summer X, Russia's first large-scale naval exercise in over 10 years. Recognized as the best crew of the best fleet in the Russian Navy, this exercise for the crew of the Kursk seemed like it was going to be just another day of practice for the men on board, preparing themselves for when the real thing would be required of them. And, after a long delay, at 11:29 AM, the order was finally given for the submarine to fire its first torpedo. But then it fell silent, and almost seemed to disappear. Not long after its disappearance, though, strange things started to appear on seismic arrays around the world. First, activity registering 1.5 on the Richter scale was detected in Norway. Then, it was followed by something 250 times more powerful. Both were the Kursk. When the submarine and its crew would eventually be found, it would find itself in the middle of angry and grieving families, a political crisis, and a battle for control between some of the strongest factions in post-Soviet Russia.
The crew of the Kursk, seen here earlier this year, preparing to sail on one of the newest nuclear subs in the Russian fleet. They are now entombed as the Navy races to attempt a rescue. However, officials admit there's little hope of saving the men.
The Kursk had been deemed unsinkable, and amongst a tired, money-starved and run-down ex-Soviet Navy, it really stood out as something that could pose a threat to any adversary. It was also one of the few submarines in the Russian fleet authorized to carry a full load of weapons at any given time. The double-hull design of the sub gave thought to the idea that even a direct hit from a torpedo wouldn't be enough to sink the Goliath. The inner hull being constructed of almost 2 inches thick steel plating. This itself was then cocooned inside an 8mm steel plate outer hull. It frankly wasn't a wild idea that the sub could survive almost anything. The key word there being almost. When the Peter Veliki, the ship meant to be hit by the dummy torpedo, felt its hull shudder from the massive explosions, they reported what they had felt to the Northern Fleet headquarters, who promptly, in old Soviet fashion, ignored the report. And even when the Kursk failed to make radio contact later in the day, the commander of the same ship was still not concerned, knowing all too well just how bad a state the Russian Navy and its equipment was in at the time, chalking up the lack of radio contact to the Kursk's radio communication equipment breaking down. Either way, a plane was dispatched in an attempt to find the Kursk on the surface, but nothing was found. The rest of that day would be spent sending plane after plane, hoping to find the Kursk sitting atop the waves, but instead it sat almost 100 meters below, on the ocean floor. Each minute that passed without finding the sub put the commanders of the Northern Fleet more and more on edge. It wouldn't be until almost 12 hours after the initial explosions that Summer X would be called off, and that Russia's submarine rescue ship, the Mikhail Rudinsky, would leave port, hoping to find both the submarine and its crew alive and well.
Was unclear, though one theory suggested she collided with a foreign vessel.
Chances of survival, the key issue there is, did they manage to get the bulkhead door shut? If they didn't, then the submarine would be full of water by now, and this is all academic.
Taking part in a naval exercise in the Arctic waters of the Barents Sea north of Norway when disaster struck. After disappearing from radar, she was found on the seabed in 150 meters of water. Her nuclear reactors were shut down, leaving the crew with just a few days of air.
In the words of US Senator Howard Baker, it is almost always the cover-up rather than the event that causes trouble. And he's right. The Russian government was more in the business of covering up than telling the truth, both in terms of what had happened and what was currently happening in the form of rescue efforts. from the start, the Russian Navy downplayed the seriousness of the incident. The Northern Fleet Admiral Popov telling reporters, even when he knew the Kursk was presumed sunk, that the exercise was a resounding success, and spoke highly of the operation. It wasn't until 7 AM the following morning that Putin himself was informed, and was then promptly told not to go to the disaster site. Either way, the truth was going to come out, and before long the families of the crew on board began to worry. The naval base at Video was small, so when the telephone operator overheard that a submarine was in trouble and its name, what was currently rumours, became something much more worrying. While the families of those on board desperately tried to get answers about what had happened to their loved ones, new lies had to be created by the Russian government as to what was the cause of the incident. The funny thing is though, the US knew that the Kursk had sunk even before the Kremlin did, as NATO was monitoring the exercise from afar. Hearing about the sinking led to a slew of offers of assistance from foreign governments, including the US, the UK, Italy, France, Germany, Israel and Norway, all of which were rejected by the Russians, telling the American embassy that they had it under control, when they clearly didn't, with the Russian government even going as far as to blame a NATO submarine for colliding with the Kursk, causing its sinking. But while they desperately tried to tell any lie to cover up what had happened, 118 crewmen still lay at the bottom of the sea, and a very real rescue operation was currently underway.
Though it's believed the Russians don't have the expertise, and while the US does, there's some doubt the American submarines are compatible. Defence analysts fear the catastrophe now unfolding could be repeated again and again in a Navy so desperately short of funds it's unable to properly train its crews or repair and re-equip its fleet.
Going to be an atmosphere laden with carbon dioxide. The people are going to feel very sleepy. It's going to be very cold. There won't be any electricity to power systems.
As the government was trying to cover up what was happening, real efforts were being made to attempt to rescue the 118 men still trapped 108 metres below the surface. It wouldn't be until 9 AM on Sunday the 13th of August that the rescue ship Mikhail Rudnitsky would manage to reach the scene. But reaching the scene would be one thing. Then began a long process of preparing the submersible for launch, with it not entering the water until much later that same day. All the while, time ticked away for those perhaps still alive down below. But the AS-34 submersible only lasted an hour below the waves, before a collision forced it to surface. Although it did manage to catch glimpses of the prop and stabilizer of the Kursk before sustaining damage. The sub was down there, but the difficulty of getting to it was becoming apparent. The first full images of the Kursk would tell an incredibly distressing story. When deep-sea cameras were lowered to the sub, they found it listing 25 degrees, with a bow that had managed to plough itself 22 metres into the clay seabed. This, paired with the fact that the periscope was still extended on the sub, clearly meant that the explosions had occurred close to the surface. The AS-34 was eventually repaired and then sent down once again, this time managing not to collide with the sub, but also unable to attach to the aft escape trunk of the Kursk's 9th compartment. If they could attach and create a seal, then they could gain access to the sub and hopefully rescue anyone who is still alive inside. But with low batteries, from several attempts, the submersible had to return to the surface. The following days would contain every type of impediment to progress you could imagine, ranging from bad weather to broken submersibles, with even having to rip parts off the AS-32 in order to give them to the AS-34 just to keep it functional. Eventually, outside help would be needed. Foreign help was finally called for, 5 days after the initial incident occurred. 2 teams of British and Norwegian divers, alongside the British rescue submarine LR-5, arrived on the scene on the 19th of August. And when they finally managed to reach the air control valve, the valve that upon its opening would allow them to enter the sub, they were told by Russian experts to open the valve anti-clockwise, or they risked breaking it. But try as they may, the valve refused to open. So they then went against their instructions and turned it clockwise. And would you believe it, the valve opened, allowing them to enter, using the arms of an ROV to force open the hatch. The inside was completely filled with water, And then they found the bodies. No one had survived. They were all dead. The rescue was over. Now that rescue attempts had failed, that only really leaves one question. What the hell caused a nuclear-powered submarine to so catastrophically explode and sink to the bottom of the sea?
Naval officials were quick to stress there are no nuclear warheads on board and no danger of the reactors leaking. Why she sank was unclear, though one theory suggested she collided with a foreign vessel.
So what had happened? It all traces back to the torpedo that was being loaded by the crew. They were filled with HTP, or high-test peroxide. This type of fuel was much cheaper than the typical silver-zinc batteries in use by other navies at the time. Using this fuel, although dangerous, wasn't a problem in itself. It still needed a catalyst to cause a reaction to make it go boom. That catalyst started to appear in the form of bad welding. This particular torpedo had been part of a batch of 10 that had been left over from when they were made in the 1990s, almost 10 years before the particular incident. On top of this, many parts of this particular torpedo had gone long past their service life. So on that day, when the torpedo was loaded into the missile silo, ready to fire, the HTP leaked from the cracks in the torpedo's casing. Then it came into contact with the bronze and brass used to manufacture the torpedo tubes, causing it to violently expand to 5,000 times its original size. It also had the side effect of causing the torpedo's 500 kilogram kerosene fuel tank to explode, killing all 36 men at the command post at that time. It also started a fire. It's this fire, 2 minutes and 14 seconds later, that caused the detonation of the remaining torpedoes. The explosion ripped a 2-meter squared hole in the side of the Kursk, opening the first 4 compartments to the sea, killing all those in those first few compartments that were still alive following the first explosion. The only men that remained were positioned in the rear of the submarine, behind both nuclear reactors that had successfully shut down almost immediately. From the 6th to the 9th compartment, 23 of the 24 men that had been stationed in these areas had survived the initial 2 explosions. Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Koznikov wrote as one of the survivors. It's 13:15. All personnel from Section 6, 7 and 8 have moved to Section 9. 23 people are here. We feel bad, weakened by carbon dioxide. Pressure is increasing in the compartment. If we head for the surface, we won't survive the compression. We won't last more than a day. All personnel from Sections 6, 7 and 8 have moved to Section 9. We have made the decision because none of us can escape. Then he wrote again at 15:15. What he wrote was almost illegible, as the carbon dioxide and the lack of lighting started to take hold. It's dark here to write, but I'll try by feel. It seems like there are no chances, 10 to 20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Here's the list of personnel from the other sections, who are now in the 9th, and will attempt to get out. Regards to everybody. No need to despair. Koznikov. But whether the crew members who had tried to escape died from carbon dioxide poisoning or some other cause, we will never know. The escape hatch in the 9th compartment will end up never being used. Although the sinking of the Kursk was a tragedy, it didn't start and end with just the 118 crew that unfortunately met their end that day. It caused uproar in all of Russia and even the world, with the majority of the blame sitting on the Russian government's shoulders, especially Putin's. But he was all too ready to attempt to turn this tragedy into an advantage for both himself and his political career. The salvaging and rising of the Kursk was going to be one of the largest ever undertaken at the time. 2 Dutch companies, Smith International and Mamet, were hired by the Russian government to raise the sub from the sea floor at a cost of $65 million. On October 8, 2001, 14 months after the initial incident occurred, the Kursk was raised, finally being taken back to the Russian Navy's Roslaykov shipyard in Murmansk. In the end, all the families of those on board the submarine would end up receiving 10 years' salary a free apartment in any Russian city of their choice, alongside free education and counselling for each of them. But no matter what they were offered, it would always fall short of the damage losing a loved one had caused them. Accusations of underfunding and covering up were heavily levied at Putin. During a meeting with the families, the atmosphere had gotten so intense that many in the room thought they were going to attack him, with even one distraught mother claiming, "You better shoot yourselves now, we won't let you live, bastards." This justified anger, alongside several oligarchs' media channels pointing the blame firmly on Putin's head, forced him to hit back, stating that their claims about the state of the Russian armed forces and the ignoring of foreign help were all lies. "They're lying, they're lying, they're lying," he shouted to the families gathered at the meeting, going on to state that there are people in television today who, over the last 10 years, destroyed the very army and fleet where people are dying now. They stole money, they bought the media, and they're manipulating public opinion. However, what he failed to mention is that no matter how much funding was diverted or how much corruption occurred, he was still the person that ordered the exercise to go ahead, regardless of the state of disrepair the Russian Navy was in at the time. Either way, this disaster wasn't going to be the end of Putin's career. His ability to blame others for his mistakes was somewhat legendary. From explosions that he used for invasions,
Georgia's South Ossetia region, battling that could draw Russia into a full-scale conflict. Georgia claims
to calling those who dared to stand up to him extremists and traitors.
Take a look at this. Russia's state news agency just announcing that the prominent Russian opposition leader, Boris Nemtsov, has been shot and killed.
He never seemed to lose his grip on power. Today, there's a monument at the Church of the Saviour on waters in Murmansk. The sail of the submarine was salvaged from the scrapyard and placed on display as a constant reminder of all those who lost their lives that day. It simply states, "To the submariners who died in peacetime."